In late summer 1957, just a few months after Bumpy Johnson returned to Harlem from Alcatraz prison, he was sitting in the black Buick, driving along the road toward Newark, New Jersey, when he spotted a sight that made the air inside the car freeze. A rundown diner with a handwritten sign taped right on the glass door reading "Whites only. No colored served." Nat Pettigrew glanced over and immediately turned to whisper, "Bumpy, let's keep going. This place isn't for us." But Bumpy didn't reply. He stared at the sign as if reading an entire era it represented. Wee Richardson said, "Boss, don't stop here," and Benny Egg Davis shook his head, but the Buick slowed and then came to a complete stop. Bumpy sat still for a moment, his eyes never leaving the racist sign. Nat added, "Bumpy, this is their territory, not Harlem," but Bumpy remained silent. He simply opened the door and stepped out with the demeanor of a man who had already made up his mind long before. "Oh Lord, here we go," Benny muttered, and all three quickly followed. They knew that look on Bumpy's face, the look of a man whose silence was more terrifying than any threat. Bumpy stood in front of the diner with the sign, Rossi's Diner, a place still frequented by Gambino and Genovese soldiers, where even a strange white man wouldn't dare walk in casually, let alone a black man fresh out of prison and known as the King of Harlem. Pee Wee whispered, "You walk in there and it's really gonna be something," but Bumpy stayed quiet. Then he headed straight for the glass door, each step making the three men behind him hold their breath. They didn't know what waited inside, only that when Bumpy Johnson chose to cross a threshold, no sign in the world was strong enough to stop him. When Bumpy pushed open the door to Rossi's Diner, the bell jingled and the entire room instantly went still. Everyone in the place, Mafia soldiers, regular customers, turned to look at the black man who had just entered. No one spoke. The air in the diner thickened until you could clearly hear the ceiling fan turning softly overhead. Bumpy took a few more steps. The door closed behind him and the three men with him lined up instinctively, as if they had just stepped into the territory of a pack of wild animals. From the kitchen, Ettore Rossi emerged, his face flushed from the stove heat and from what he was seeing. He held a dish towel but didn't bother wiping anything, his eyes freezing when he recognized Bumpy Johnson, and the first words he spoke, as if passed down from father to son, were, "We don't serve your kind here." The room fell silent again. Bumpy's expression didn't change. He walked straight to the counter, placed 2 fingers on the wooden surface, light as brushing off dust, but firm enough for everyone to understand. This man hadn't come to turn back. "I read the sign outside," Bumpy said, "but I want to know who decided I have to obey it." A young Mafia guy in the corner laughed, deliberately tossing out a racial slur that made a few others chuckle along. Bumpy merely raised 1 finger without even turning around. That single gesture was enough to make all 3 of his men freeze. Rossi crossed his arms, trying to regain his stance. "Get out of here before I call the cops. If I was afraid of the cops..." Bumpy replied, eyes never leaving Rossi, "I wouldn't still be alive in Manhattan since 1930. A few customers exchanged glances. The mocking smiles from earlier vanished, replaced by slow recognition. The man in front of them wasn't lost, and he definitely wasn't the type to flinch at the mention of police. Bumpy continued, "In Harlem, people respect me, not because of my skin color, but because I keep the neighborhood out of the hands of people who don't keep their word." Rossi tried to stand taller, raising his voice to mask the flicker of uncertainty. "This is Italian land." Bumpy tilted his head just slightly, but enough to make the whole room tilt with him. "I saved an Italian in Harlem back in '49. He lived because of me, and today you tell me I don't belong here." Everyone in the diner looked at Rossi. No one was laughing anymore. It felt like the wall of prejudice Rossi had clung to his whole life had just lost one brick, then another. The sound of someone's spoon hitting a plate rang out so clearly the whole place heard it. Rossi didn't answer right away. The room now hung heavy with waiting eyes, with confusion even they didn't fully understand. Bumpy said nothing more. He just stood there, hands relaxed, gaze calm but utterly uncompromising. And it was that very calm, not shouts or fists, that began making Rossi feel something he had never felt in his own diner. He was no longer the one in control. As Rossi stood frozen behind the counter, Bumpy looked straight at him and said each word clearly. "I'm asking you one thing. Since when did you think you had the right to decide who gets to walk in here, and who told you that line was real?" Rossi faltered, trying to stay composed, but his eyes darted away then back. "I just do what my father did. This place has always been like this. It's not for your people." Bumpy tilted his head. "The problem with always is it makes people repeat things they never even questioned." He didn't press, yet Rossi grew more unsettled than any shouting could have achieved. The space in the diner slowed, not from fear but because everyone knew this conversation was heading into territory no one dared touch. Bumpy went on. "In Harlem, Italians, Jews, black folks live side by side, not because they like each other, but because they understand. Respect is the only thing keeping everything from blowing up." He scanned the room, then turned back to Rossi. "I've helped people who didn't look like me. I've pulled them out of trouble their own neighborhood created, not out of charity, but because I believe in the principle respect gets respect in return." Rossi gripped the towel tighter. "You make it sound simple, but you don't understand the pressure. I can't just let anyone walk in. I have to hold on to my family's way." Bumpy asked softly, "Hold on to it, or hide behind it? Those are two different things." Then he said plainly, "You say this is what you were taught. So think about it. Has it made your life better, or just made you afraid to see someone else sitting at the same level as you?" Rossi fell silent. He had no explanation. An older Mafia soldier at the end of the counter spoke up, breaking the tense quiet. "Ettore, he's not wrong. How many years have we gone doing business in their neighborhood? Have they ever turned their backs on us?" Another man spoke from a table near the door. "This isn't the 1920s anymore. A man's strength isn't measured by skin color." A few of the younger guys looked at each other, their earlier arrogance fading. The whole room was inching toward a truth they had tried to avoid. Rossi turned to them and saw eyes no longer fully on his side. He muttered, "I'm not against anyone. I'm just following tradition." Bumpy replied immediately, "Tradition isn't bad, but if it makes you treat others wrong, then it's just an excuse to avoid changing." He pulled a $20 bill from his pocket and placed it clearly on the counter. "I'm paying for the coffee I haven't drunk yet, and I'm paying for your chance to do the right thing." Rossi stared at the money, at Bumpy's hand, at the silent room. He asked quietly, "If I do it different, do you think it's worth it?" Bumpy answered, "It's not what I think, it's what you know." Then he stepped closer. "A real man doesn't need a sign to prove his worth. He proves it by how he treats the person standing in front of him." Those words weren't loud but carried clearly through the entire diner. The whole place waited to see what Rossi would do. A long moment passed, then Rossi turned, walked to the glass door. He reached up and pulled down the whites only sign. The old sign came off the nail effortlessly. He held it for a few seconds as if weighing his entire life, then rolled it up and tossed it straight into the trash can behind the counter. The sound of it hitting the bottom was sharp and final. The diner seemed to exhale, as if released from something they themselves hadn't understood why they clung to for so long. A few people clapped lightly. Others simply nodded, not in support of Bumpy, but in support of a moment they knew was right. Bumpy pulled out a stool and sat at the counter, his expression calm as if he had just finished a casual conversation rather than dismantled a decades-old tradition. "Now give me a cup of coffee," he said. "The kind you serve people you respect." Rossi nodded, his hands still a little stiff, but his voice softer, coming right up. Everyone in the diner knew the boundary had just been erased, not by violence or threats, but by words that forced them to look at themselves. Rossi stood behind the counter, picked up the coffee pot, and poured it himself into the cup he placed in front of Bumpy Johnson. Never in his life had he imagined he would one day serve a man whom New York's underworld whispered about with respect, but at that moment there was no reason left to avoid it. Bumpy didn't look at Rossi or the coffee. He used the corner of his eye to observe the whole room, calm as someone who had sat in places 10 times more dangerous. Rossi leaned in slightly. "I don't know how you take your coffee," Bumpy replied. "The same as any other man." A simple sentence, but Rossi felt something drop inside his chest, a shame he perhaps had never fully allowed himself to feel before. The atmosphere in the diner began to shift. Murmurs of conversation returned, still quiet, but no longer heavy. Hostile stares disappeared, replaced by curiosity, then gradual careful observation. A few older mobsters narrowed their eyes at Bumpy, as if verifying whether this man truly matched the stories they had heard from Harlem. They saw him sitting straight, hands holding the hot cup, not showing off, not acting superior, yet somehow still owning the space around him. Bumpy didn't need to raise his voice for authority. His composure alone ensured no one in the diner dared disrespect him for another second. Rossi stood behind the counter, twisting the towel, and finally said something he never thought he would say in front of anyone. "Mr. Johnson, I was wrong. It was simply the apology of a man who had gone too far to hold on to a tradition he no longer believed in." Bumpy looked at him, voice soft but sharp. "You know it. I know it. No need to say more." Those words didn't humiliate Rossi. They lightened him as if the burden he had carried from his father's generation had finally been set down. The echo of the sign being removed seemed to spread through the room. A few new customers walked in, looked around, noticed the racist sign was gone. They hesitated a moment, then chose a table without a word. A middle-aged Italian woman passing Rossi stopped, looked at him with an unreadable expression, then gave a small nod, an acceptance. Bumpy stirred his coffee. The metal spoon clinking against the cup rang in the quiet room like a marker that everything had just changed direction. No more tension, no more hostility, only respect that no one in the diner had thought they would give a black man that afternoon. From a table near the door, a young soldier whispered to his buddy, loud enough for others to hear, "That's why they call him the King of Harlem." What they had just witnessed wasn't the power of fists, but the power of a man who knew his own worth. Rossi had just turned back behind the counter when a group of mobsters began moving toward Bumpy, as if drawn by an invisible pull closer to the man who had just altered the entire atmosphere of the diner. An older capo, silver hair close to his scalp, stepped forward first. He looked at Bumpy for a moment, then said quietly, voice carrying acknowledgement rather than challenge, "You just stood there, and the whole room had to watch. That's what makes people respect you." Bumpy gave a small nod, an acknowledgement enough for the capo to step back, and enough for others to approach without feeling they were crossing a line. Another Italian man in his 40s, broad shoulders, shirt dusted with breadcrumbs, leaned on the counter. "I heard about how you kept Little Africa clear of the dope pushers. Even the kids in Newark talk about it now." Bumpy replied, "I just protect where I live. Everyone wants to keep their own block safe." Not a speech, just plain words that made listeners feel he was speaking to them man to man. No need for fancy phrasing. A younger mobster gathered all his courage to step closer and say, "I want to apologize for Etowah. Our generation, we grew up on the wrong things." He bowed his head, voice dropping low. Bumpy looked him straight in the eye. "If you're going to fix it now. Waiting till you're old is too late." The words weren't long, but made the young soldier stand still for a few seconds, as if swallowing a lesson he never expected to hear from a black man in an Italian diner. Rossi watched the whole scene from behind the counter, and realized the looks the mobsters gave him were no longer accusatory. He glanced at the trash can, where the rolled-up whites-only sign lay at the bottom. He knew that moment would follow him the rest of his life, reminding him that following the old path isn't always the way to stand tall. As people in the diner continued approaching to greet Bumpy, Rossi placed a plate of fried eggs in front of him. Bumpy cut a piece and ate. The taste wasn't special, but Rossi knew this moment was more special than anything he had ever served. A man at the next table said loud enough to be heard, "I've never seen anyone walk in here like that, and then sit and eat like he belongs." A few nodded, not because Bumpy was flexing power, but because he made them feel the place had just been reordered. The door opened. A white family walked in. The husband froze when he saw Bumpy. The wife looked at Rossi. Rossi stood still, face directly toward them. Just one clear look, stronger than any words. After a few seconds of silence, the man pulled out a chair and sat down. The hesitation faded. An invisible boundary that had existed in people's minds for years tilted and then fell without anyone pinpointing the exact moment it vanished. A group of younger mobsters gathered near the counter, not daring to interrupt the older men's talk, but unable to take their eyes off Bumpy. One whispered, "What did we just see?" The one next to him answered, "A man who changed the whole room without raising his voice." Those whispers spread like a new feeling. Respect not based on fear, but on witnessing someone step over a barrier they hadn't dared to try. Rossi stepped closer to Bumpy, not to apologize again, but to say what he knew was true. "Mr. Johnson today will stay with me a long time." Bumpy looked at him, then turned back to his eggs, as if the words needed no reply. But Rossi understood he had been heard. Half-joking, half-serious comments from customers began to rise. Someone said the place felt different today. Someone else said they'd come back more often. No one spelled it out, but everyone understood that moment wasn't created by Rossi. It was laid down by Bumpy. Pee-wee stood nearby, arms crossed, taking it all in, then leaned down and whispered, "Bumpy, you just did what the whole city council couldn't do in years." And in that simple moment, the entire diner realized they had witnessed something bigger than the removal of a sign. They had seen a man walk into a place that wasn't his, then make it change in a way no one could forget. The rumor spread faster than any car on the Newark, Manhattan route. In just one afternoon, the Mafia networks of New Jersey and New York were passing around the same story. Bumpy Johnson walked into Rossi's diner and made editor take down the sign. And finally, the line that made everyone who heard it pause and think, just with words. In a world where power was usually measured by scars and bodies dropped over a glare, that story sounded almost unreal, but its very unreality made people spread it faster. In Newark, in Elizabeth, in tiny Italian towns scattered across 2 states, owners of small diners quietly looked at the whites-only signs hanging on their doors since their grandfather's time, then heard the Rossi story repeated hour after hour. But one by one, those signs began to disappear. Some were taken down at night, some rolled up and stuffed in storage as if they had never existed. No one admitted why they removed them, but everyone knew the answer. No one wanted to be more outdated than Rossi. No one wanted to be seen as the one who didn't know how to change when the whole community had heard what happened at that diner. A few days later, people passing by began to notice the difference. A young waiter at a small place near the train station looked at the empty glass door and said to his coworker, "They took the sign down not because they're scared of the law, because they know there are people like Bumpy out there." The way he said it wasn't fearful, but respectful, as if in that story, Bumpy hadn't just convinced Rossi, he had convinced the onlookers too. In small local Mafia meetings, when Bumpy's name came up, people no longer placed him in the black Harlem gangster category. They used a new title, the man who reasons, not someone easy to bully, not someone using violence to prove himself, but someone with principles so clear no one could dismiss him. One capo said during a meeting, if he wanted to fight, Rossi wouldn't have a diner to stand in the next day, but he chose to talk. That's something a lot of people here can't do. The words made the room quiet for a few seconds, not in anger, but because they knew it was true. In a society where every decision tied to money, territory, and face, it was rare for a non-violent act to make an entire community re-examine itself. Yet that was exactly what happened. The story of Bumpy spread like a lesson no one asked for, but everyone had to accept. And at Rossi's diner, after unusually busy days with locals coming to see the place where it happened, Ettore Rossi stood at the door, looking at the late afternoon sky turning pale purple. He said nothing, thought nothing, profound, just felt a lightness he had never known. The racist sign was in the trash, and he understood he should have done it 20 years earlier. But late was better than never. That day, for the first time in years, Rossi stood straight when he locked the diner door, as if another door, not the diner's but his own, had just been opened. 1 year after the afternoon that changed Rossi's diner forever, Bumpy Johnson passed through Newark again, on his way to a business meeting in the area. The Buick slowed, as Pee Wee looked out the window and said, "Bumpy, how about we stop by and see that place? It's probably different now." Bumpy didn't speak, just nodded lightly, and the car turned into the familiar lot. When he pushed open the door, the bell jingled again. But this time no one startled. The first thing Bumpy saw was a young black man wiping tables, wearing an apron like every other employee. The second was the genuine smile of Ettore Rossi. Not a polite smile, not a fearful one, but the smile of a man who had finally let go of a rock he had carried on his chest for decades. "Mr. Johnson," Rossi said, "your usual table is right here." The way he said it wasn't flattery, but a greeting to a customer who had become part of the diner's story. When Bumpy sat down, Rossi took the seat across from him, something he would never have done before. He began telling about the days after that one, how people in the neighborhood were surprised to see the sign gone, how some long-time customers reacted strongly, how others supported it. He told about the first time he had to explain to his brother, a Genovese soldier, that their family diner no longer turned anyone away. "I was ashamed I stayed stupid so long," Rossi said. There were things I thought I understood perfectly. Turns out I understood nothing. Bumpy didn't repeat the old lesson. He just listened quietly, like a patient teacher letting the student say what he needed to say. Then Rossi spoke of small but real changes, more new customers, some old ones returning, others apologizing for having opposed it. He said, "What you did walking in here, you don't know, but it went far." And Bumpy knew, but he didn't say. In later visits, Bumpy realized it wasn't just Rossi who changed. A few Italian places in Jersey began following Rossi's example, quietly, without announcements, but Bumpy heard people say they invited him to eat so they could say what needed saying. Some even sent word that if Mr. Johnson stops by, we're ready to welcome him. That didn't make Bumpy proud. It only confirmed what he had long known. Sometimes a small change creates ripples no one can measure. Once, when Pee Wee joked, "You did that, and now you think you changed all of Jersey, huh?" Bumpy just smiled and said, "I didn't change the world, I just talked to one man." Everyone around who heard that understood it wasn't humility. It was a simple truth no one could deny. Rossi increasingly saw Bumpy as the one who reminded him of what he should have understood when he was young. He no longer looked at him as a customer, an enemy, or the Harlem boss, but as the man who pulled him into a brighter side of life he thought he would never reach. And one slow afternoon, Rossi led Bumpy into the kitchen to show you something. On the wall, right next to where the pots and pans hung, was a small wooden plaque, carefully nailed, words carved with a knife. "Respect feeds more men than hate ever will." Rossi stood beside it, offering no explanation. Bumpy looked at the plaque for a while, then turned away, saying nothing more. Both understood that line wasn't hung for decoration. It was a reminder for Rossi every morning he entered the kitchen, and every night he locked up, that one day he had chosen to stand on the right side, and that choice had changed not only his family's diner, but himself. In 1963, an early autumn morning in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson received a yellow envelope, no return address, just a few slanted words in the corner, "Rossi." That was enough for Bumpy to know what he was about to read. Inside was a folded sheet, handwriting sparse, both firm and trembling, the writing of a man unaccustomed to showing emotion, but forced to say what he had held too long. Rossi wrote, "Mr. Johnson, 6 years have passed, but the day you walked into my place feels like yesterday. I've spent many sleepless nights thinking about that sign in my hand, and what you made me realize. I thought I was preserving family tradition. Turns out I was just preserving the wrong my father and grandfather left behind." The next line stretched longer, ink darker where he pressed harder. "I want to say thank you, not thank you for sparing me, but thank you for not choosing violence. You showed me that real strength doesn't always come from keeping a gun in hand. True strength comes from daring to look at yourself, and you forced me to do that." Rossi wrote that since removing the sign, he began teaching his son different things. "I told him that story, and now I tell my grandson too. I want them to know that one day their grandfather was wrong, and another man showed him a better path. I don't want them growing up in the shadow I once lived in." Then came the line that made Bumpy sit up straight, eyes darkening, not from anger. "You made me see the thing I feared looking at most, the truth." Bumpy set the letter down, leaned back in his chair. He didn't smile, didn't frown, just a long silence, the silence of someone hearing something he already knew, but never expected, acknowledged. Nat Pettigrew walked in, holding a cup of coffee. Seeing the letter on the table, he asked who sent that. Bumpy nodded toward it. Nat picked it up and read, eyebrows rising at the part about Rossi's grandchildren. When he finished, Nat let out a short laugh. You know what? If you'd punched Rossi that day, all he'd have now is a scar story to brag about. But now, Nat shook his head, half laughing, half sighing. You turned the whole Jersey Mafia into philosophers. Bumpy still didn't smile. He looked out the window where Harlem buzzed under the sunlight. Kids running across the street, news vendors at the corner, a few hustlers chatting near the corner store. The world was the same, but the letter in his hand said that somewhere, a small corner had changed. Bumpy picked up the letter again, read it once more, then very slowly folded it into thirds. He opened his desk drawer, where only a few things were kept for their sentimental value. Mame's smiling photo, an old lighter, and now this letter. He placed it inside like evidence no one else should casually see. Nat leaned against the wall watching the action, and understanding that for Bumpy, this wasn't praise, wasn't a victory, it was the remainder of a moment he would never bring up again. The old envelope lay on the table, edges slightly curled from being opened by hand. The final signature, Ettore Rossi, had a tremble, but was clear, as if the writer had poured all his resolve into signing it properly. And that very tremble said the most. A lifetime had finally found enough courage to step to the other side of itself. In 1965, on a gray morning in Newark, news of Ettore Rossi's death reached Harlem not through newspapers or obituaries, but through the underworld's familiar channel, a verbal message from an intermediary Genovese soldier. The man found Pee Wee first, voice raspy from cigarettes, saying just one thing. He wanted Mr. Johnson to know. He kept his word. For people who lived their entire lives between shadows and honor, a sentence like that was enough to convey everything that mattered. When Pee Wee relayed it, Bumpy simply nodded once. He didn't ask what Rossi died of, didn't ask about the funeral. Everyone knew that silence of his. He received the information with his heart first, then let his mind process it later. 2 days after the funeral, Bumpy decided to go to Newark. No one in the crew asked why. The black Buick stopped in front of Rossi's diner late in the afternoon, when the streets were quietest and the sunset shone straight through the glass door, making it look more like an old photograph than a living place. Bumpy opened the door and walked in unannounced. They simply stood up, gave a slight bow, then stepped aside, as if they had been told that if this day came, they must greet him in absolute silence. The diner hadn't changed much. The space still small, still smelling of scorched coffee and grease, still cream-colored walls stained by years. But one thing was completely different. The white panel by the window, where the racist sign once hung, was now completely clean. Not just physically clean, but clean as if a deliberate part of memory had been left behind. No nail marks, no faint outline, as if the sign had never existed. That said more than any apology ever could. Rossi's wife, Maria, stepped out from behind the kitchen counter. She wore a simple black dress, eyes slightly swollen, as if she had cried a lot, but was still holding herself steady. When she saw Bumpy, she paused for a second, then walked straight to him. "Johnson," she said, voice trembling but clear, "my husband told the story of that day dozens of times, maybe more. He always said it was the day that changed his life." Maria clenched her hands. "He said, if you hadn't said what you said that day, he would have lived his whole life blind." Bumpy didn't answer right away. He just looked through the diner's dim light, as if replaying that 1957 afternoon, when he walked in, stood before Rossi, and spoke words he himself hadn't expected to carve so deeply into another man's life. Maria continued, Before he passed, he asked me to give you this. I kept my word. I lived differently, and I left without owing that any more." She finished and stood still, not crying, just holding the steady gaze of a woman who had watched her husband change more in those years than in the 3 decades before. Bumpy looked at her for a while, then nodded. Just one small nod, but enough for her to understand that Rossi's message had reached the right place. After that, Bumpy walked to his old chair, the one he sat in the first time after the sign came down. The chair was still there, in the exact spot, as if Rossi had never let anyone else touch it. Bumpy sat down, hand resting lightly on the table. The wood surface had worn down, but when he touched it, it felt very real, very alive, like a piece of the past still beating right under his palm. The diner made no sound. Staff stood far off. No one dared intrude on that moment. Bumpy looked around slowly, eyes deep and dark in the noir way of a man who had lived his life on the thin line between right and wrong. In the stillness of late afternoon, in the smell of old coffee and the steady turn of the ceiling fan, he said not a single word. He just sat there, in the place where he had once faced hatred and witnessed it disappear forever. That very moment was the true legacy of a day no one would ever forget. Many years after the events at Rossi's diner, when the name Bumpy Johnson had become part of the oral stories in both Harlem and Newark, people still referred to that afternoon as a rare example of power that didn't require shooting or threatening. In a world where gunfire usually ended every argument, Bumpy's action relied only on the steadiness in his eyes and a few well-timed words. No one understood that better than those who had witnessed it, because they knew real power doesn't lie in who shouts louder or holds a gun longer, but in the man bold enough to walk into a room not meant for him and change it without spilling a drop of blood. Once, during a closed-door meeting with local press, a young reporter asked Bumpy about the Rossi's diner incident, voice full of curiosity. "How did you convince him to take down the sign? Did you use your influence?" Bumpy looked at him for a moment, eyes showing no emotion, then answered with just one sentence, "I just walked through a door." The rest, he opened himself. No elaboration, no explanation. The words sounded so simple, people thought he was dodging, but for anyone who had stood in that diner in 1957, they knew he was telling the truth. He didn't threaten Rossi, didn't flaunt Harlem's power. He simply forced one man to face himself, and the rest happened exactly as he said. Rossi opened it himself. The lesson of that story wasn't just for one place or one group. It was a reminder that even in the Mafia world, where fists and guns were usually the final answer, sometimes the strongest thing is the courage to speak truth right in the face that doesn't want to hear it. And that sometimes a small moment, taking place in an old diner with peeling paint and grease-stained walls, can create change far beyond what anyone imagined. No one at Rossi's diner that day thought they were witnessing anything grand. But the racist signs disappeared from Newark to Jersey City. Diner owners changed how they looked at black customers, and fathers told their children about the day they stopped hiding behind old traditions. All of it began from that moment. As time passed, Rossi's diner changed hands and gradually became a small family pizza shop, but one thing remained unchanged. On the wall near the door, people hung a small wooden plaque with deeply carved words. In 1957, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson showed us that respect, not fear, is the true strength of a man. Just one line, short, direct, and enough for anyone who read it to understand that sometimes the greatest thing isn't defeating the world, but making another human being want to become better. If you like stories like this, subscribe so you don't miss the next part. Thank you for following. See you again in the next stories.